I've been asked many times why I believe in God. There's a lot to it for me. For me, it is a little like asking, why do you believe in magnetism? Because it's such a big part of so many things that I see. When people ask for a list of reasons I believe in magnetism, I would be tempted to ask, how long do you have? I have a cell phone in my pocket with an SD card that encodes information in magnetic switches. I have a compass that uses a magnet to point north. I have a magnet on my fridge that holds up my grocery list. How far do you really need me to go? And sure, every one of these can be countered with, you don't actually know that there are magnetic switches in the SD card. And you don't know that a magnet is how a compass points north. And I think your grocery list just has a sticky back to stick to the fridge. Or even, I don't believe you have a grocery list at home. So I'm not really interested in arguing the points. If you're going to be skeptical, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you not to be skeptical or that you have to believe in God. But when you're this open-ended, I'm not really sure who you are or what will speak to you. For me, the most convincing thing is the resurrection of Jesus. When you compare the resurrection of Jesus to other well-established historical facts, it actually stacks up very well. There are those that will say, it's the best established fact in history. But no. This is a misunderstanding of what history is at best, or a drastic overstatement of the details at worst. But I like to compare like to like. If you believe A based on evidence B, and C also as evidence B, then rejecting C is emotional, not logical. One go-to example to compare the resurrection to is the slave rebellion under Spartacus. If we compare the documentation related to the teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus to the documentation related to the escape, rebellion, and death of Spartacus barely 100 years earlier, we see a surprising number of similarities. For example, Spartacus is only recorded in a few sources. For Spartacus, these are only Plutarch, Frontinus, Florus, and Appian. Although Dr. Ehrman gives a good reason to count several more sources for Jesus in his book. Did Jesus exist? This maps well to the four Gospels. It's unbelievable that a runaway group of slaves could have taken on the vast Roman army and held their own for so long. And yet, no matter how believable it is, the records are clear. Spartacus left almost nothing in the archaeological record, which is similar to Jesus. The wars which Rome fought with runaway slaves were recorded in other sources, and the church serves the same purpose as the aftermath of the resurrection, as the aftermath of these wars to prove Spartacus. Simply put, if you're going to reject Jesus and his resurrection as unhistorical due to lack of evidence, then Spartacus and many other well-accepted historical people and events will have to go as well. The slave rebellion led by Spartacus, known as the Third Civil War. We only have a few records of the event that survived to the present day. Of these, the backstory given to Spartacus is completely different in two of them. There's a reason it gets the name. Third, also, in the 300 or so years surrounding the event, the Roman Empire only experienced 3 wars with rebellious slaves that lasted more than a few months. Medical resurrections happen even today. They're known under the name Lazarus syndrome. A heart that has been stopped for 5 minutes most likely isn't going to start again, yet there are documented cases of Lazarus syndrome that have taken multiple hours to wake up. As far as our best understanding goes, several of these well-documented instances should not have been able to recover. Yet they did. There was a case study that identified 38 cases between 1982 and 1993. So if you're going to reject the resurrection because they're rare, then you have to reject the slave rebellion under Spartacus because successful Roman slave rebellions were even more rare. One of the hallmarks of proving that someone understands a subject is the power of prediction. For example, when the solar eclipse of 1919 revealed that the stars changed apparent positions in the sky near the gravitational well of the sun, it silenced the critics of Einstein's theory of relativity. In one sense, the resurrection of Jesus isn't all that special. It is only one case of Lazarus syndrome among many. Except that Jesus predicted it in advance. That means that he really knew what was going on. And he said that the reason he would be raised is because he's the Son of God. We may argue about how to parse that, in much the same way people still argue about how to parse some of what Einstein had to say about space-time. What does it really mean for time to move more slowly? Anyway, however we parse it, it means there's a God to be son of. For me, that is the most convincing because it is grounded in history and study. For some, it has a lot of moving parts, and that's a problem. It's a lot to take in, and so they just cast it aside as too difficult. To those, there is a fallback position which I also personally find convincing. When something is complicated and a matter of deep study, we trust the experts. We trust our doctors, our electricians, our historians, and so on. And in all of these fields, there are places where the subject gets deep and controversial. And in all of these subjects, there's always going to be obscure minority voices that no one else in the field takes seriously. But in all of these fields, there's a core set of things agreed upon by the vast majority of those that use that data professionally. It's called academic consensus. It's hard to quantify, but it is still a guiding principle across fields. If you look at theology, you're going to find that the academic consensus is that God is real. Yes, there are arguments about what exactly that means. And there are obscure minority voices that disagree. But if you walk into any 10 theology departments in schools and ask them to write a combined statement on whether God is real or not, and restrict it to a binary answer, you'll get a yes. So in that sense, following atheism is like following flat earth theory. Yes, you can find obscure experts to quote, and you can twist reliable experts to your side, but yours is the minority opinion in the field of study, and it is the position that is not producing continued scholastic pursuit of the subject. Past that, there are some who are more philosophically driven. They're looking for a proof, like you would find in a geometry textbook. Well, theology isn't math, but I've always found the moral argument compelling. I'll come back to the other classical arguments in a moment, but for me, the moral argument is the one that describes the God we should want to worship. This is already long enough, so I'm not going to explain that. I can relate the moral argument to the gravitational argument. Moral argument. Moral argument premise 1. If there are moral values, then God exists. Moral argument premise 2. There are moral values. Moral argument conclusion. God exists. Gravitational argument. Gravitational argument premise 1. If objects fall without external force, gravity exists. Gravitational argument premise 2. Objects fall without external force. Gravitational argument conclusion. Gravity exists. The first premise in each is what's called an analytic proposition. It's a kind of definition. God is the substrate under which morality exists, the way that space-time is the substrate under which gravity exists in relativity, or water is the substrate under which waves exist at the beach, or the electromagnetic field is the substrate under which magnetism exists in Maxwell's equations. To say that you disbelieve in God under the moral argument is to say that you are not a moral realist. The second premise for each is observational. When someone says that murder is wrong, it is very rare to find someone that means, well, just according to my feelings, it's not really wrong to those who feel it's not wrong. I've never met anyone who wasn't a moral realist after having something irreplaceable and valuable stolen from them. But that's all to one side. Humans are going to human. Except we see the principles of morality in animals, and even fungus and plants as well. I suggest looking up the work of Dr. Franz de Waal to see this in action among animals. He's got a TED Talk that's very accessible. But even among things that don't have brains, it has been found that fungus distribute nutrients to plants in their networks according to how much the plants give back to the collective. so the principles behind morality can even be seen at that level. Of course, as mentioned in other sections, this leaves open a lot of discussion about what exactly God is. But people have had long discussions about what gravity is, and what the electromagnetic field is, and what water is too. 500 years ago, there was no one that would equate water with hydrogen and oxygen, yet today you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that doesn't see it that way. It's the same for the other areas mentioned. They didn't get to that point by arguing whether there is water, or whether there is gravity, or whether there is magnetism. They defined their terms, and worked with each in terms of what they could see in it. So if you want to drag theology back to the days of alchemy in your corner, that's fine. Those of us who take deep study seriously will just ignore you the same way we ignore modern-day alchemists, who want to argue over whether magnetism is real or if water is really a thing of its own. There are, of course, other philosophical arguments for God, the cosmological, the ontological, etc. For me, these are all convincing in their own right, but they're all also at least in part analytic propositions. Sure, there has to be an uncause first cause or an unmoved first mover, but who cares? I had a grandfather, but he wasn't all that great, and I don't want to hold him up as an example. I had other grandfathers that were great, but work with me here, I'm making a point. But if the first cause was the moral substrate, then it kind of by definition has to be the thing to look up to. For me, the fine-tuning arguments are the best evidence we have that the same principle is behind the formation of the cosmos, the laws of physics, and our moral obligations. For me, it only wins the argument because we're grading on a curve, though. The fine-tuning argument has a lot of, as far as we know, statements baked into it, and as we learn further we may learn that these don't hold up. But as it stands, with what we know right now today, it's better than other proposed explanations. To put it in perspective, the many worlds hypothesis is actually an attempt to get around the idea of an ontological or cosmological decision maker, and so you're essentially in the place of having to choose between believing in one of three things. Either there's an invisible cosmological architect that may be the same as the moral substrate. There are alternate universes of which we see no evidence and cannot ever see evidence, or there's an option that no one has thought of. There's an option that no one has thought of is an option for literally everything, including gravity, magnetism, and water. So people who chose that as their go-to without very strong reasons to reject the options that people have thought of aren't usually taken seriously in their fields of study. Unless they're providing another real alternative, in which case they've thought of something, and it's not really something no one has ever thought of before any longer. That leaves you with invisible universes, or the cosmological architect. And so on for the other classical theistic arguments. Past this is the evidence from miracles. I suggest Dr. Craig Keener's 2-volume set for that argument. For miracles that are well evidenced, I suggest looking up the life of George Mueller. I'm not really sure how far I should go, as I said at the start. There are also moments in my life that point to something beyond the physical. When my first son was in the hospital, I had a dream about him being in distress, and I was able to freak the nurses out by what I knew about his situation while we weren't there. For me personally, when I see how delicately and yet intelligently the systems of the planet work together to keep things right for us, it amazes me. We're pushing the systems to their limits right now with industrial CO2 emissions, another conversation for another day, but without that there were systems in the oceans that absorbed carbon from the air when it was high and released it when it was low. And those systems didn't always exist because we can track times when they didn't work back when the dinosaurs were alive. And yet, they're geological and not biological. The ice caps serve as heat sinks, again geologically and not biologically. And yet, that only works if one of them is over a continent and the other isn't. Examples could be multiplied for weeks, but I'm getting tired. Then, there are a bunch of things that are tiny evidence in favor of it. Every ancient culture has concepts of divinity, And when disconnected ancient cultures talk about similar things, they tend to be objective. Cases in point: the stars, mathematics, and weather. There's no sign that there's any life except us out there. And yet all of our best estimates say that unless there's something really, really, really special about here and now, life should have started long enough ago somewhere else to be basically everywhere in the sky. If we're that kind of special, that's the kind of special that kinda hints at a plan. Intelligence wasn't a thing that was developing on our planet until about 1 million years ago. The smartest dinosaurs would have had stiff competition at your local chicken coop on an IQ test. Yet all of a sudden 1 million years ago or so, whales, birds, apes, and cephalopods all started getting smarter. Almost like someone said, "I've got this physical thing figured out. Now let's play with minds." All of the things I've put in this paragraph I put in the very slight evidence list. If that was all we had then, I wouldn't believe. But they make more sense in a world with a God than one without. Kind of like if all the evidence I had for magnetism was my SD card, I wouldn't believe. But it makes more sense as part of a complete system that includes it under the category of things that use magnets when that category is otherwise well evidenced. This isn't an exhaustive list of all the evidence that I think points to God being true, but it's a good start. These are a sample of the various levels of evidence that speak to me.